This talk was given by Roshi Rafe Martin, guiding teacher of the Endless Path Zendo, a lay Buddhist community in Rochester, New York. Join our practice, in person or online, at endlesspathzendo.org.
So today is December 14th, 2024. Today really concludes our extended recognition of the Buddha's great effort, his tremendous trauma as a young man in facing impermanence, the reality that all things, not just people, but ants and galaxies, everything, ages, sickens, dies, that everything we know is impermanent. This was terrifying to him. This was not, it just checked this box on my spiritual path. This was trauma. And it so terrified and shook him to the core that he had to leave his most comfortable life with all the luxuries known to what was possible for human beings at that time, and go out alone into the wilderness of his own mind to find the root of it all, to find a resolution to it, to find how to live with peace and joy in the very face of impermanence, not shutting it down or attempting to, as many people do, run off to buy something more or do something to alleviate. He went to the root of it. And there's nothing wrong with alleviating one's anguish, believe me, but when it becomes a habit, when it becomes what we do instead of attempting to mature in face of reality, mature in wisdom and compassion, which only can come from truth, not from hiding from it, then we create problems, as we're seeing in our world. If you run from reality into power, into selfishness, to things like that, you'll create harm. We're going to deal with that in our lives. It's right upon us. And it's showing the alternative to choosing to really grow up as a human being. And the Buddha path is to grow up as a human being, not to deflect one's terror to harming others. So today, which is the final day of the Vermont Zen Center's 7-day Rohatsu, our Rohatsu ended last weekend, but it's a kind of continuous period, a week before and a week after the 8th, which is the resonant moment in Buddhist history, which is said to be the 8th day of the 12th month is when the Buddha, Rohatsu means 8th day, which is why some Zendos, as I did with Aiken Roshi, Diamond Sangha, at Pololo in Hawaii, we did an 8-day Rohatsu. So that's the focal point, and it spreads like a pebble dropped into a pond. It radiates from that date backward for a week and forward for a week. So today is the end of that forward movement for a week. And we looked at the Buddha's leaving home on our Saturday of our little Rohatsu. We looked at the enlightenment on the Sunday. The leaving home is now posted at our podcasts, and the enlightenment will be posted very soon at the podcast. But today we'll look at the mature Buddha and his teaching. And I'll be reading again from an earlier book of mine from last year, A Zen Life of Buddha. And we're looking at now the section on teaching. And we're starting with the essential story. As Zen is said to be a teaching not dependent on words or letters, but one that points directly to the human mind, it should come as no surprise that Zen tradition, as the essence of the Buddha's teaching, finds this approach already fully alive with the Buddha right at the start. In other words, the Buddha is the original Zen Master who teaches by demonstrating and presenting rather than simply by talking about it. He offers living truth, not philosophy. Like the monk in the 10th and final Zen Oxherding picture, he enters the marketplace of ordinary life with helping hands, which sounds pretty good. Who doesn't need help? But what does such help look like? What kind of help does the enlightened Buddha offer? To clarify this, here's Gateless Barrier, Mumenkon in Japanese, case 6. The Buddha holds up a flower. And the case goes like this. Once in ancient times, when the world-honored one was at Mount Gridrakutta, which is Vulture Peak, one of the Buddha's favorite teaching places near Rajgir, or Rajagaha, in Bihar, India, he held up a flower before his assembled disciples. At this all were silent. Only Mahakashapa broke into a smile. The world-honored one said, I have the all-pervading eye of the true Dharma, the subtle mind of incomparable nirvana, the true form of formless form, and the gateless gate of the supreme teaching. It is not established upon words and phrases, and is transmitted outside all teachings. I now entrust this to Mahakashapa. So a tiny gesture can become a profound teaching. If you remember the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, seated beneath which would have taken place, according to Buddhist tradition, 25 to 2,800 years ago on December 8th, seated beneath the Bodhi tree, the Buddha simply touched the earth and asked the earth, it's such a wonderful image, asked the earth to witness for him, witness the truth of his worthiness, and so vanquished Mara, the tempter, that subtle, ever-doubting voice of one's own egotism, really. In this case here, he holds up a flower and transmits the Dharma. Each slight gesture speaks volumes and has the power to transform lives. So after his great enlightenment, to back up a bit, the Buddha had a choice. He could stay where he was, seated under the Bodhi tree, in bliss, freedom, and insight, that is, in the joy of his attainment. And indeed, legend says he was sorely tempted to do just that, or he could begin the profoundly absurd, even perhaps impossible task of saving the many already saved but still deluded as to their own true nature and so still suffering beings. It took even him a while to resolve this fundamental challenge. After his profound realization, he sat beneath the Bodhi tree, some sources say for 3 weeks, completely absorbed in this utter freedom, this utter joy, this total transcendence, completion, wholeness. Some sources say 7 weeks. Didn't stir, just completely absorbed, completely gone. A morning star sits beneath the Bodhi tree. He glanced up and saw the morning star, and that was it. He was emptied out, absorbed in liberation, insight, and joy. Now, during this time, a legend also says, a storm arose, and as the newly awakened Buddha sat on unmoving, the Naga serpent king, Mukalinda, rose up out of the earth and spread his cobra hood over him, protecting the new Buddha from wind and rain. It's this great image of something rising from the depths, not descending from the sky, rising from the depths and raising its hood over the Buddha in this terrible, terrible storm, violent storm. And he sat there just so absorbed, completely gone. He probably didn't even notice that he was protected by forces rising up out of the earth. A really great image. In the midst of the storm, he was facing a dilemma. Could realization be taught? Could he or anyone teach it? He was perfectly whole from the beginning, from before the beginning, because everyone already had it. How could you teach people to attain what they already each had in full? How can you enter a room you never left? That's the great paradox. This is the challenge of all teachers. The truth, while open, clear, and irrefutable, once it's seen, cannot be mentally or conceptually grasped. But could it be pointed to? Or would others have to find their own way to where they already were if they only knew it when their karma ripened? But that would take a long time. And for many of us, it would have involved an awful lot of suffering. Teaching could speed things up. And still, though, as there was nothing to gain, and from an absolute perspective, no beings to gain it, why even try? What was there to say? From the start, it was done, given, accomplished. From the very beginning, all beings are Buddha. What are you going to get beyond that? So could he now just relax, live a joyous, unburdened, easy life, and when the karma of this life played itself out, step into the completeness of parinirvana, gone, completely be gone. Giving up the body, we call it death. Gone beyond, completely. Why take up this crazy, impossible task? Zen calls it putting on the holeless iron kang. You know what a kang is? It's what criminals kind of would be put in. There's a place to put your head, and then it locks around your hands, and there you are. But teaching is like putting on an iron kang with no hole. There's no place to put your head. It's completely impossible. Totally absurd. So that was the Buddha situation. He broke through to what no one else had realized at that point in this cycle of history about our own nature, our own mind. Now what? Is there any point in teaching? Everybody already had it. He could see that clearly. Well, the gods, it said, who had intervened at the time when he was Prince Siddhartha and getting restless at the age of 29, and they got him to go out into the city and really look and see a sick man, an old man, a dead man, it said, and a wandering truth seeker. It said that the gods had taken those forms because his mind was ripe to really be struck to the core by seeing that. As I said before, we may not get struck like that because we're inoculated. We've seen it every day of our life. We're used to it. Oh yeah, sickness. Oh yeah, death. Oh yeah, aging. Sure. But his father, wanted to protect him completely from seeing impermanence, and it backfired because he was so sheltered when he did see it. It was like getting hit by a hammer. Bam! And it set him off on the very path his father had dreaded all along, seeking enlightenment. So now the God stepped in again, reminding him that anguish was everywhere and that there were many ready to hear and put his teaching into practice. The image they gave him was evocative, and the gods showed him a vision, which seems to be how gods speak, of living beings that were like lotuses in a pond. And they showed him that some were buried in the mud at the pond's bottom. Some had risen from that bottom mud and were up in the water. Others were now just below the surface. They could see the light shining through the surface of the water. And others were now really above the water and opening in sunlight. All, the point is, all were equally lotuses. Not like some were more lotus than others. They were all equally lotuses, but all in different stages of actualizing, opening to their own potential. It's a really kind of wonderful image of human beings in relation to realization of our own nature. That was a gift of the gods. And Buddha, by the way, the word Buddha has the same original root as the word to bud. So a Buddha is a budded being, using that same floral metaphor. Now, where do intuitions and promptings to do our best regardless of challenge or risk come from? It seems instinctive for some people to respond courageously and selflessly to whatever's going on. Abraham Lincoln spoke of the angels of our better nature. The promptings of gods or angels seems as good a metaphor as any. Moved by such divine encouragement, and again, where do such things come from? The Buddha set off from beneath the Bodhi tree along the dusty roads of his native land. From that moment on, he was teaching in everything he did. Whoever he ran into, he was teaching. While realization could not be taught, he did see that there was a way to it that could be taught. And that became the Eightfold Path, a path of living with attention and clarity, ethical foundation of life. And really the core of it, seeing clearly, being really present. And that was something that he obviously could do. And because of that decision 2,500 or so years ago, at least 2,500 years ago, history suggests it may be a couple of hundred years further back, we now have this practice, this path, and what we're going to deal with today, this flower. Again, that floral metaphor, Buddha is a budded being. All beings are like lotuses, different stages of opening. And the Buddha holds up flower. So the Buddha had to have trusted his audience and their intrinsic potential when he held up that flower. Like the ringing of a bell, the taste of tea, the wetness of water, the pain of a stubbed toe. There was just this flower. Who didn't have eyes to see it? He was, teisho really means presenting the shout. He was presenting the shout, giving a lecture. He was demonstrating. Still, it must have been astonishing, more than 2,500 years ago, so long before holding up a flower had become a New Age cliche, for the perhaps thousands of people who had gathered and were waiting expectantly for the Buddha to give a profound teaching, to see just a flower. They'd been thinking, would he perform miracles? And that was, this is India 2,500 years ago. Even now, we get crowds of people when there's some spiritual person going to speak. Thousands of people. But back then, they expected, this was the Buddha. Miracles. They thought gods might descend from the sky. People would be enlightened right there. Bam, wham. It was going to happen. Anything was possible. And the Buddha did none of those things. Without explanation, he just held up a flower. It was radical. It's like Beethoven smiles, doesn't play a note. Shakespeare simply bows and walks off the stage. The Buddha holds up a flower. Was there disappointment, confusion, nervous laughter, shouts of charlatan, countered by intricate defenses of the Master's great wisdom? Most likely all of that and more. A flower was held up, but a seed was planted. Maybe some puzzled over it, wondering, is the Buddha saying we should be like this flower? Is he telling us to live like this flower without concerns for what is to come? If they did, they might have benefited from such thinking. They'd have a parable to lean on. But Mahakashapa alone just cracked up. It cracked him up. And he broke into a smile. Why? And why does Master Wu Men, who wrote The Gateless Barrier, compiled it, insist we must individually explore this as a koan, not simply take it as an article of faith or as a parable, which other traditions might be more likely to do? As a koan, it is no longer legend, it is no longer history, it is no longer the Buddha's story, it is no longer Mahakashapa's story. It steps out of history and is our story. It is our dilemma. It is our truth right now. We realize this flower. The story of the Buddha's enlightenment in the Soto Koan collection, Denkoroku, a transmission of the light, which was a Japanese creation after Dogen returned to Japan. It's a second-generation heir, Keizan Joken, put together the entire transmission from the Buddha up through Dogen with verses, teishos on each, verses from each, and their koans that we work on towards the end the very end of our koan curriculum. This is his verse for the Buddha's enlightenment, which is the opening transmission. One branch from the old plum tree extends splendidly forth. Thorns come forth at the same time. That's true. Anybody who's practicing Zen knows that that's true. Thorns come forth at the same time. You have this, oh, yes, wow, fantastic, the Buddha, enlightenment. I want that. That's so terrific. And then, oh, my knees hurt. Oh, this is boring. I just sit here. Oh, I've got to make time in my schedule to do this thing. Oh, it's cold outside. I don't want to go, etc., etc. Oh, I got wrung out of Doksan. This is my fourth time on the same koan. I can't stand it. Yeah, thorns come forth at the same time. For our present purposes, we can say that the difficulty of grasping this thorny point, what is realization anyway? What is this enlightenment anyway? Believe me, there are many watered-down versions of it out in the Zen world. We've been fortunate to come through lineages, both Kapleau and Aitken, that insist we touch base with realization in our own minor ways. But we have to do it for real, no matter how minor. Not just water it down. So we can say that this thorny point has fortunately come down to each of us. Without this flower, there would be no Zazen, no Sesshin, no Zazen Kai, no Zen teaching, no you and me practicing, and all of the challenges we face. No flower, no Zen. It's that simple. Without this flower and Mahakashapa's blossoming smile, the Buddha would have passed into his parinirvana, that is, eventually aged and died, and his teaching would have become a dusty pile of fading words. Wonderful words, excellent words, another pile of words. Instead, we have a living transmission of practice realization extending through generations. Wu Men's commentary is quite something. Gives you a taste of Wu Men. Here it comes. Golden-faced Gautama, of course, the Buddha was Siddhartha Gautama when he was a prince. Golden-faced Gautama is certainly outrageous. Outrageous. He turns the noble into the lowly, sells dog flesh advertised as mutton, as if it were so wonderful. Dog flesh is probably not a dish we'd like to consume. If you're a meat eater, mutton probably sounds much more delicious, much higher grade kind of food. But here he says, the golden-faced Gautama is certainly outrageous. He turns the noble into the lowly, sells dog flesh advertised as mutton, as if it were so wonderful. However, now he gets into the meat of it. Suppose that all the monks had smiled. How would the all-pervading eye of the true Dharma have been transmitted? Or suppose that Mahakasapa had not smiled. How could he have been entrusted with it? If, here's the corker, if you say the true Dharma can be transmitted, the golden-faced old man with his loud voice, how about that for a description of the Buddha? The golden-faced old man with the loud voice. Interesting Wu Men's perspective. Deceived the simple villagers. Golden-faced old man with his loud voice deceived the simple villagers? If you say the true Dharma can't be transmitted, why did the Buddha say that he entrusted it to Mahakasapa? Whoa, Master Wu Men wants us to get clear, not remain distant, vague, or abstract about the nature of realization, kensho, awakening, enlightenment, intimacy, and Dharma transmission. What is realization? And what is transmission? When the caw of the crow sounds within my own heart, what other could there be? Selfless intimacy is realization. But what is transmission? Does it differ from realization? If so, how? If it didn't, then anyone with some realization should receive transmission. But that's not what happens. Many people are passed on koan, indication of some degree of realization. Some complete the entire koan curriculum. Some do. Those who stay with it, those who persist, those who keep coming, those who stay at it. They do it because they have to. Keep going. Good number of people, they keep at it, can complete the koan curriculum. But very few receive transmission, even if they've completed the koan curriculum. Please remember, in teisho, it's a form of zazen, so try not to be moving around. You do zazen, you stay in your zazen posture. If you need to change position, then do so quietly and attentively so as not to distract others, even on Zoom. Everyone sees everyone. So please remember, this is a form of our practice, not listening to a lecture. So, while the Buddha transmitted the all-pervading eye of the true Dharma to Mahakāssapa alone, didn't everyone there equally have original enlightenment? Original mind? Didn't the Buddha himself proclaim this truth at the moment of his own great insight? Wonder of wonders. All beings are Buddha. So why does he say that Mahakāssapa alone has it? Plus, when the all-pervading eye of the true Dharma was transmitted, what did Mahakāssapa actually receive? Ananda, the Buddha's first cousin and attendant, he of perfect memory, said that his memory was so perfect that he could remember every word the Buddha spoke, and it's from him that all the Buddha's teishos, the sutras, have come down to us. He repeated them after the Buddha's death, and they were written down. So he wanted to know, Ananda really wanted to know, so what is given with transmission? And he had faithfully attended the Buddha for many years, and it said, in fact, so great was his regard for the Buddha as a person that he really couldn't awaken to the Buddha's teaching while the Buddha was alive, because he was just so moved by the very presence, the person of the Buddha. He held it in such a high regard. It created a kind of separation between him and his own potential for realization. So he was anxious and puzzled when the Buddha had passed away about this thing called transmission. Mahakāssapa had received Dharma transmission. He was now the teacher. So what did Mahakāssapa have or get that Ananda and others didn't? After the Buddha had passed into his parinirvana and Mahakāssapa was leading the community, Ananda went to Mahakāssapa and asked him about it. And this is case 22 of the Gateless Barrier, Mahakāssapa's flagpole. And it goes like this. Ananda asked Mahakāssapa, "The world-honored one transmitted the golden robe to you. What else did he transmit to you?" In other words, okay, you got his golden robe and you got his begging bowl. But what's transmission? What did you get? Nanda was really hurting. He really wanted to know. What was the difference between him and Mahakāssapa, who had received transmission? Mahakāssapa answered Ananda, saying, "Ananda." Ananda said, "Yes." Mahakāssapa said, "Pull down the flagpole at the gate." That means teisho's over. Pull down the flagpole. They put up a flag announcing there's going to be a Dharma talk today. Teisho's over. Yeah! Pull it down! Dane and Henry Roshi received the Dharma from Philip Kapleau Roshi and verification of that from Robert Aitken Roshi. He transmitted his Dharma to me, making me his heir. Does that mean our minds are telepathically linked? Do we now think the same inexpressibly lofty thoughts? What was transmitted? According to Buddhist tradition, the insight that began with Shakyamuni Buddha in this world cycle, and there are said to have been previous world cycles and previous Buddhas on this very planet, let alone elsewhere on planets throughout the universe. This was what was transmitted to Mahakashapa, who transmitted it to Ananda, who likewise transmitted it on and so on and on, transmission after transmission through the past 2,500 years down to us today. This is the legend, and while its truth resides in the actualities of practice realization, the reality is complex. There was not just one line of transmission. As much as various lineages would like to keep it totally pure, it all came down to me. Not quite so. It was rather like mycelium seeds, mushroom seed, threads, mycelium threads, multiplying, spreading, overlapping. That's what transmission was kind of more like. Increasing in size and density, outward as well as inward, realization springing up in multiples, a web of realization extending outward to the limits of each generation, a jeweled web, a fungal mat of insight, absorbing and welding together a new cultural frame, the practice forms themselves coalescing and adapting, evolving and maturing. But in essence, all of what we practice, all of how we've benefited from practice originates with the Buddha's awakening and this very first transmission to Mahakashapa. In short, it comes from this flower. Yet did this moment with the flower ever really happen? Aiken Roshi asks, would it make a difference if the Buddha never existed? Here's his view. True religious practice is grounded in the non-historical fact of essential nature. The world-honored one twirls a flower by Chong's fox, which is case 2 in the Gateless Barrier, and all the other fabulous cases of Zen literature are your stories and mine. Intimate accounts of our own personal nature and experience. That's from his book, Gateless Barrier. The flower, in short, is being held up now. This is the moment in which the Buddha gives his teisho, raises a flower, and Venerable Mahakashapa breaks into a smile. It is not far off in time or space, not lingering back in history, and yet, though it is here now, it can take hours, weeks, years for any one of us to see it clearly enough to continue the legacy bequeathed to us by the Buddha, Mahakashapa, Ananda, and all the teachers who followed after them. Regardless of where we may individually be at, each of us will leave our own legacy for good or evil to future generations. Whether we have children or not, whether we teach Zen or not, each of us merely by existing on this planet will leave a legacy that extends to all future generations, a legacy for good or for ill. What shall our legacy be? Some legacies in the end, no matter how much power they may seem to hold, turn out to be just dust and ashes. Some legacies are simply shameful, and others remain endlessly green, capable, like a flower, of bringing forth new life. Ryokan, the Soto priest, poet, calligrapher, an extraordinarily humble human being. I've always loved Ryokan's poetry. One of the most moving times in our pilgrimage to Japan in 2016 was to visit his training temple, Ensuji. It was just really so beautiful. If you don't know Ryokan's poetry, I recommend taking a look at it. He tended to sit alone, play ball with children, drink sake with farmers, completely pure, humble, awakened human being. In any case, this was his final verse, one of them, not the final, but towards the end of his life. My legacy, what will it be? Flowers in spring, the cuckoo in summer, and the crimson maples of autumn. That was the whole thing. My legacy. What will it be? Flowers in spring, the cuckoo in summer, and the crimson maple of autumn. This seems so simple as to be really hopelessly naive, and yet, what a glorious legacy it is. Especially now when legacies of trauma and chaos are so on the rise. To leave the seasons as they are, which each thing giving forth its life just as it has always been. Flowers in spring, the call of the cuckoo in summer, the crimson maples of autumn. What a profoundly selfless legacy. Not so naive after all. In his commentary to the case of the flower, Woman brings us fully home. Golden-faced Gautama is certainly outrageous. He turns the noble into the lowly, sells dog flesh advertised as mutton, as if it were so wonderful. In short, what he's saying is, get down off your pedestal, O Buddha. You're hawking cheap goods as if they were the high-class stuff. But what are you really up to with your radiant golden face shining like a morning star? Then he goes on to ask, what if all the monks had smiled? Would have been there, or would there have been transmission then? And what if Mahakashapa hadn't smiled? How would things have played out then? Can something as profound as Dharma transmission depend on such flimsy supports as a flower and a smile? Can the true Dharma be transmitted? What is it, after all? And how does it get passed on? Is there some deception at work? Is the myth a lie? Did the golden-faced old man with the loud voice deceive the simple villagers? And who are these simple villagers, anyway? Joseph Campbell pointed to myth as the highest and furthest language can go into truth before language itself must settle into the profundity of silence. Yet when Wu Men takes pains to downplay all such profundities, golden-faced old man, simple villagers, hardly seem the stuff of legend. Maybe Wu Men's verse will help us. Here's his verse, holding up a flower. The snake shows its tail. Mahakashapa breaks into a smile, and people and devas of course are gods, people and devas are at a loss. Holding up a flower, the snake shows its tail. Mahakashapa breaks into a smile, and people and devas are at a loss. Holding up a flower, the snake shows its tail. Hold on. Isn't a snake all tail? Holding up a flower, then, is the whole deal. The whole nature, the whole mind, the entire character fully exposed. Nothing's hidden. How often we hear that in Zen. We struggle with koan after koan, beating our brains out to get it. Yet nothing is hidden. It's there plain as day, and when we get it, we go, ah! It was so simple. It was right there the whole time. I just didn't see it. And that can take years. It's crazy, isn't it? Nothing's hidden. It's an open secret. And yet if it is an open secret, how could there be deception? In his Zazen Wasan, chant in praise of Zazen, which is what we do before every teisho, Master Hakuin writes, what is there outside us? What is there we lack? Nirvana is openly shown to our eyes. This earth where we stand is the pure lotus land, and this very body, the body of Buddha, and this very body, this flawed, this impermanent, this aging mess of a body of Buddha? It's getting. Yet, open and unhidden as it is, how hard we work at it. Breath by breath, sitting after sitting, sesshin after sesshin, koan after koan, and still its full blossoming, this flower's full blossoming, still evades us. We keep at it, yet hardly seem to have begun. It is the old paradox. If what we seek is not hidden, but right where we are, why don't we see it? Why don't we fully know it and live it right now? What's this having to go a whole lifetime of practice? Why don't we live it right now if this is really who and what we are? Only the Venerable Mahakashapa seems to be in on the joke. And he just cracks up, breaking into that smile. Everyone else, even the devas, even the gods, seem confused, which is when Wumen relents and offers us some relief, acknowledging that our dullness is not all that unusual. Why should we be ashamed about it when even arhats, bodhisattvas, and gods are thrown for a loop by the simple flower? And yet, there's that tail. In a very different context, case 38 of the Gateless Barrier, which is of the buffalo passing through a window. It's a fascinating koan. Goso's buffalo, Wutsu's buffalo. Wutsu said a buffalo passes through the window. Its head, horns, body, and legs all pass through. Why can't the tail pass through? Isn't that wonderful? Why can't that tiny little tail pass through? If the huge head and the horns, the hump, the legs, the whole deal, the buffalo passes easily through the window, but the little tail can't pass through. In any case, Wumen's writes about this at the end of the case in the verse or the commentary, this tiny little tail. What a wonderful thing it is. This tiny little tail that can't pass through. What a wonderful thing it is. With this reference to the snake and its tail, myth slithers back in. A snake in Buddhist tradition can be a wise and powerful naga, a great serpent being. Nagas, Buddhist legends say, guard the perfect wisdom, Prajnaparamita teachings, in jeweled underwater palaces, waiting right now in their underwater palaces, waiting for the day when human beings will be mature enough to receive these teachings in full. A little aside about that, I've also always liked to think that whales may be the inspiration for the wise Naga beings living in jeweled palaces under the sea. Certainly their great brains, their essential kindness, their intricate languages suggest that we're dealing with very wise beings. Makes perfect sense that the Buddha entrusted the perfect wisdom teachings to them until human beings were actually evolved enough to receive them, because the teachings of form is emptiness, emptiness is form, can be very dangerous when not well understood. It can fall into nihilism. It can fall into anything goes, it's all empty. And then you have monsters arising in the human realm all too easily. So, fortunately, the great wisdom beings, the Nagas, are holding these things hopefully one day we will be grown up enough to receive them as a culture, as a people. This is something to be devoutly yearned for, a consummation, as Shakespeare said, devoutly to be wished for. In any case, so given that old man, that golden-faced swindler hawking his cheap goods and holding up a flower, showed his real identity. Seeing that tale, all is revealed. And lo and behold, he's no swindler, but a great Naga-like wisdom being. And that flower he's holding, why? It's actually great treasure. Isn't that a terrific joke? Doesn't it just crack you up and make you, like the venerable Mahakashapa, want to break into a smile?